The battle for Italy was to be one of the most bitterly fought and protracted conflicts of World War II. Although Sicily was captured comparatively easily in the summer of 1943, Allied attempts to exploit Italian disarray through landings on the Italian mainland were doomed to frustration and disappointment. The Italian armed forces played virtually no part in the campaign. When the Allies landed at Salerno in September, the country was occupied by the Germans, and the landings themselves were contested by first-line German formations. The battle for Salerno was only the first in a series of battles fought between the Allies and the Germans in southern Italy. The country was ideal terrain for defense, mountainous, rugged, and scored by deep ravines and fast-flowing rivers. From Naples, the Allies fought their way slowly northward, before being brought to a halt at the Gustav Line, the last German defensive position before Rome. From December, the front remained deadlocked, despite several offensives and landings behind the Gustav Line at Anzio. The line was finally broken in May 1944 by a major Allied offensive involving 12 divisions. The breach opened the road to Rome and relieved the Anzio bridgehead, which had now been under siege for nearly 4 months. The capture of Rome in early June effectively brought the campaign to an end. Although the fighting in Italy continued almost to the end of the war, the principal Allied objectives were achieved, with the seizure of the Italian capital and the collapse of the Axis as a military and political alliance. In November 1942, Italian ambitions to dominate the Mediterranean and to carve out an empire in Africa suffered a paralyzing blow. At El Alamein, the British 8th Army comprehensively defeated a combined German-Italian army, destroying several Italian divisions and sending the remnants in full retreat through Egypt to Libya. In the same month, British and American forces landed in the French North African territories of Morocco and Algeria. The landings were only seriously contested by French naval units defending Oran and Casablanca. When these were defeated, further French resistance soon came to an end. The Allied landings and the lack of commitment shown by the French prompted Hitler to send troops by air and sea to occupy French Tunisia, before it too fell to the Allies. 2 days later, German forces marched into Vichy France itself, unilaterally abrogating the armistice agreements of 1940 and putting an end to the fiction of Vichy French autonomy. In December, rain and mud brought the fighting in northwest Africa to a halt and allowed the Germans to consolidate their hold over all the principal Tunisian ports and airfields. In late January, the Axis bridgehead was further strengthened with the capture of key strategic passes in the eastern dorsal and significantly reinforced by the arrival of the German-Italian forces withdrawing from Egypt and Libya. In February, these forces combined to launch an attack against the American Second Corps, holding the most southerly sector of the Allied line. The attack threw the Americans into confusion, and within a few days, German armored formations were pouring through the Kasserine Pass into the rear of the Allied positions. The arrival of the British 8th Army, however, prevented any further exploitation of this breakthrough, and by early March, the Axis had been forced back onto the defensive. In mid-March, the Axis front line in the west lay along the crest of the eastern dorsal, and in the south, between the Montmartre Hills and the coast. The Mareth line was the key to the southern positions and was held by infantry forces of the Italian First Army and by the German Afrika Corps. On March the 20th, Allied attacks were launched in 3 sectors: against the Mareth line by 8th Army's infantry, west of the Montmartre Hills by a mechanized battle group driving towards El Hamma, and in the center by a reinforced American Second Corps attacking through the southeastern dorsal. For 2 weeks, the Axis defenders fought stubbornly, falling back slowly and systematically. But in early April, the front began to disintegrate, and the remaining Axis forces fled to the north to form a new front centered on the port of Tunis. In late April and early May, the Axis bridgehead was hammered remorselessly, slowly buckling and contracting under the pressure. Although now clearly doomed, Hitler insisted that the bridgehead be defended to the last. These orders merely ensured that the battle was prolonged unnecessarily, that no attempt was made to evacuate men and equipment to Italy, and that the Allied victory, when it came, was complete and overwhelming. Altogether, 250,000 prisoners were taken in the closing weeks of the campaign. But the damage to Axis power in the region as a whole was more extensive. In attempting to supply and support the bridgehead, the Italian Air Force and Navy had suffered heavily, as had the Luftwaffe, and the cumulative damage, combined with the loss of North Africa, had fundamentally transformed the balance of power in the Mediterranean in favor of the Allies. Hitler's willful determination to hold a bridgehead in Africa was all the more remarkable for the catastrophe that had resulted from a similar decision he had taken in the East. When the powerful German 6th Army was trapped in Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, he had forbidden a breakout attempt, and instead insisted that the army hold its positions until it could be relieved. From that point, the fate of 6th Army was sealed. But by committing himself to such a reckless strategy, he placed his entire southern wing in jeopardy, and inadvertently ensured the destruction of the Axis alliance as a military force. In early December 1942, the German front west of Stalingrad ran along the line of the Upper Don and the River Chir. The front was held by 2 army groups. Army Group B in the northern sector consisted of the German Second Army, the Hungarian Second Army, and the Italian 8th Army. Army Group Don in the south consisted of the 4th Panzer Army, supported by remnants of the 4th Romanian Army and 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad. The Soviet forces in the sector were deployed in 4 fronts. The Don and Stalingrad fronts, separating 6th Army from the rest of Army Group Don, and the Voronezh and Southwest fronts, facing Army Group B. In December and January, while 6th Army was slowly strangled in Stalingrad, the Soviet forces in the northern sector attacked across the Upper Don, demolishing in turn the Italian 8th Army and the Hungarian 2nd Army. These operations tore huge gaps in the front line and threatened a massive encirclement of the remaining Axis forces in the south. By the end of the month, these forces had fallen back to the Donets, abandoning 6th Army together with all the territory won in the previous year. The fighting in Stalingrad came to an end on February the 2nd. Of the 320,000 German soldiers cut off in the encirclement, only a little over 100,000 remained to be taken prisoner. Most of the rest had been killed or had died slowly of frostbite and starvation. The loss of 6th Army in its entirety was a disaster for Germany, but the damage inflicted on the Axis was irreparable. Between November 1942 and February 1943, 3 Axis satellite armies had been utterly destroyed, and a 4th so badly damaged that it was soon disbanded. In March, before the spring thaws brought the fighting to a close, the Germans reorganized their command system in southern Russia, creating Army Group South out of the remnants of Army Groups A and Don, and dismantling Army Group B. In the same month, they recaptured Kharkov, which had fallen to the Russians in February. By the end of March, the front had stabilized. Both sides were exhausted and needed time to regroup and consolidate. But for Germany, the future was now bleak. Defeats in the East and in Africa had plunged the Axis into disarray and transformed Hitler's war of conquest into a battle for survival. The Anti-Comintern Pact, signed by Japan and Germany in 1936, and later by Italy, formed the basis for the military alliance later known as the Axis. A state visit by Hitler to Rome in 1938 further strengthened the bond between Italy and Germany and helped prepare the ground for the military adventures of 1939. In 1940, after the fall of France, the Axis was joined by Hungary and Romania, and in the following year by Bulgaria. For Hitler, these alliances were essential to the security of the Reich and to the creation of a pan-European alliance against Bolshevism. They also lent legitimacy to the Nazi regime and helped to reassure the German people that they were not alone. The destruction of the Axis satellite armies in the East and in North Africa was therefore a political as well as a military disaster. Yet as far as he was able, Hitler would not desert his allies, nor would he allow them to desert him. In the summer of 1943, he would authorize plans to be drawn up for a German occupation of Italy. In August 1941, Mussolini dispatched 3 Italian divisions to fight alongside those of Germany, Hungary and Romania in the Soviet Union. In the same month, he travelled with Hitler to Brest-Litovsk to survey the devastation wrought on the Red Army during the battles on the frontier. Mussolini was impressed and fully accepted Hitler's assurance that the war in the East would be over by the spring of 1942. A year later, there were 10 Italian divisions fighting in Russia, and little prospect of a decisive victory in the foreseeable future. In Egypt, the German-Italian Panzer Army had been stopped in its tracks and forced onto the defensive. By now, Mussolini's fortunes and those of Italy herself were entirely dependent on those of Germany. The disasters that befell the Axis between November 1942 and May 1943 were therefore felt most heavily by Italy. All 10 Italian divisions in the east were destroyed, and a further 14 were lost in North Africa. Italian patience was wearing thin. In the summer, Mussolini would be deposed in a vain attempt to extricate Italy from the war. For Churchill, the victory at Alamein in November 1942 marked the end of a long period of defeat and humiliation for the British Army. Victory also restored his own political fortunes, which had fallen to their lowest ebb with the loss of Tobruk earlier that year, and the subsequent retreat of the Eighth Army through Egypt to the Alamein positions. With the final defeat of the Axis in Tunisia, Churchill's priority now was to consolidate and extend Allied power in the Mediterranean. His was the driving force behind British proposals for landings in Sicily and Italy. Behind this strategy lay concerns about long-term Soviet plans for Eastern and Central Europe. By knocking Italy out of the war, Churchill hoped to influence events in Central Europe to the Western Allies' advantage and secure Greece and the Balkans from Soviet intervention. It was this, essentially post-war strategy that most infuriated both Roosevelt and Stalin and led to serious disagreements that would fundamentally affect the conduct of the campaign. The series of setbacks suffered by the Americans in North Africa, culminating in the rough handling of the American Second Corps in central Tunisia, was a sobering experience for American planners and for Roosevelt. British doubts about the combat readiness of American troops and the tactical abilities of American commanders had been fully borne out by events. As a result, Roosevelt's position was to a certain extent undermined, and his preferred strategic priority, an early attack on the French coast, was quietly postponed in favor of the British proposal for an invasion of Italy. Neither Roosevelt, however, nor his senior military advisors were entirely happy with this outcome, and as the campaign progressed, they would gradually withdraw their support, insisting on the transfer of men and equipment to Britain in preparation for the projected invasion of France. The possibility of an invasion of Sicily was first raised in London at a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the summer of 1942. At the Casablanca conference early in the following year, the proposal was adopted as official Allied strategy, subject to one important qualification, namely that the campaign would not interfere with the preparations in Britain for a cross-channel attack on the French coast, scheduled for early in 1944. Although initially opposed to the idea and doubtful of the military value of such an operation, American planners were conscious of the need to maintain the momentum built up in North Africa. The clearance of Tunisia was taking longer than expected, and when it was finally completed, there would be huge forces available for a summer campaign. In addition, most of the principal North African ports had been brought up to full operating capacity, and all the necessary infrastructure established to maintain and service 16 full divisions in the field. For the British, Sicily was a tempting target. Situated in the center of the Mediterranean, the island was only a little more than 100 miles from the major Allied North African ports of Tunis and Bizerta. Airfields on the Tunisian plain, along with others on the North African coast, would ensure adequate tactical air support for an invasion attempt, while those on the islands of Malta and Pantelleria would provide virtually constant fighter cover. Possession of these islands also provided the Allies with comparatively secure sea lanes for the final approach of the invasion convoys. If Sicily was captured easily, follow-up operations could be mounted across the Strait of Messina, or even, in the event of an Italian collapse, higher up the peninsula. The capture of Sicily would also give the Allies absolute control over the central Mediterranean and provide additional airfields to prosecute the air war against Italy's ports and cities. The assault landings were to take place in two sectors: south of Syracuse on the east coast by the British 8th Army, and between Licata and Scoliti on the south coast by the American 7th Army. Among the primary objectives in the American sector was the capture of Axis airfields north of Gela. Primary British objectives included the capture of Syracuse and Axis airfields in the southeast corner of the island. Once the beachhead was established, the important east coast ports of Augusta and Catania were to be taken, along with a further group of airfields to the west. The final reduction of Sicily was to be accomplished by a general advance on either side of Mount Etna, to the north coast and the town of Messina, the capture of which would isolate any remaining Axis forces still fighting in the west. During the spring of 1943, while these plans were being refined and the invasion force assembled and trained, Allied air power was employed against targets in Italy and Sicily. These included ports, airfields and military bases, all of which were attacked heavily. Coastal shipping was harassed, and fighter and reconnaissance sweeps over southern Italy were incessant. The underlying objectives of the air plan, in addition to ongoing reconnaissance, were the destruction of the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force in the south, the isolation of Sicily by strategic and tactical bombing of the island's communication links, and the steady erosion of Italian morale by systematic attacks on the island's defences. Heavy bomber raids on industrial targets and major population centres on the Italian mainland were intended to disperse the concentration of effort and generally undermine Italy's already wavering commitment to the Axis. After Stalingrad, Hitler's main priority was to strengthen his position in the east. With the recapture of Kharkov, Army Group South had halted the rout of Axis forces from the Don steppe and anchored the front along the line of the Donets. North of Kharkov, however, the front line curved dangerously around a huge bulge, created in February when Soviet forces overran the Axis satellite armies on the upper Don. Yet the Wehrmacht was no longer the force it had been in 1941, when 3 million men had stormed through the Soviet Union to within 20 miles of Moscow. Nor was there any possibility in the near future of a return to Stalingrad or Moscow. The task for the Wehrmacht in 1943 would be to straighten the line in the east through a series of limited offensive operations in preparation for a long war of attrition. The bulge in the front line stretched from just south of Orel to Belgorod and was being continuously fortified by the Russians in expectation of an attack. Hitler's plan was to mount concentric offensives from the north and south towards the city of Kursk in the center of the salient. The attack in the north would be spearheaded by the 9th Army, heavily reinforced from Army Group Center's reserve. The attack in the south would be led by the 4th Panzer Army, supported by the 8th Army, both part of Army Group South. The objective of the campaign was to pinch out the salient and isolate the Soviet forces west of Kursk. This would, it was hoped, deal a damaging blow to the Red Army, and by straightening the line, enable the Wehrmacht to go over to the defensive, releasing men and formations for service in the West. By reinforcing the German-Italian forces in North Africa, Hitler, by design or inadvertently, had prolonged the conflict in the region into the early summer of 1943. The consequent Allied build-up that was to lead to the invasion of Sicily also ensured that there would be no major landings on the French coast before 1944. With France safe from attack for another year, Hitler could devote most of his dwindling resources in the West to the defense of southern Europe. But he had no clear idea of where the Allies would land. Despite the concentration of air attacks in southern Italy, there were indications that the main Allied landings would take place in Greece or in Sardinia. Greece was garrisoned by an Italian army of occupation, recently reinforced by the 1st Panzer Division, transferred from France. In Italy, there were 3 armies, one of which, the 6th, was wholly concentrated in Sicily. 6th Army was supported by 2 German divisions, the 15th Panzer Grenadiers and the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. In Sardinia, the Italian garrison was supported by the 90th Panzer Grenadiers, and in nearby Corsica, the 16th SS Panzer Grenadiers were forming up. In northern Italy, Hitler established German Army Group B, with a further 3 German divisions to coordinate all German forces in Italy. This command would eventually become the German 10th Army. These then were the principal forces available to Hitler on the eve of the Allied attack. He had little confidence in his Italian ally and expected his thinly spread German formations to intervene quickly and decisively wherever the landings took place. Like most British generals, Harold Alexander first saw action with the British Expeditionary Force in France. As commander of the 1st Division, he was charged with organizing the retreat and evacuation of the force from the Dunkirk beaches. Alexander's rearguards held the line during the final days of the evacuation and were amongst the last British troops to leave the beach. In 1942, after service in England and then in Burma, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief, Middle East. In this capacity, Alexander had overall responsibility for General Montgomery's offensive at El Alamein and shared a lot of the credit for the victory. In February 1943, Alexander was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the 15th Army Group in Tunisia. Alexander's conduct of the Tunisian campaign was exemplary, and his tact and impartiality were decisive in settling inter-Allied disputes. In the final weeks of the Tunisian campaign, Alexander used his material superiority to bring to battle all the component forces of the military alliance. This ensured that the victory honors were shared equally, and that untested formations were given valuable battle experience in preparation for future campaigns on the continent of Europe. After a brilliant career in the German army during the interwar years, Albert Kesselring transferred to the Luftwaffe, rising to become the service's most powerful and important officer after Hermann Göring, Hitler's appointed deputy and the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief. As Chief of Staff from 1936, Kesselring was largely responsible for the military effectiveness of the Luftwaffe at the outbreak of war, and subsequently commanded powerful German air fleets in Poland and the West. During the Battle of Britain, Kesselring commanded the principal German air fleet and came very close to defeating the RAF. In 1942, Kesselring was promoted to Field Marshal and appointed Commander-in-Chief South, with overall responsibility for all German operations in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Kesselring's unique understanding of both air and ground forces enabled him to coordinate their use properly, achieving results sometimes quite out of proportion to his limited resources. This was particularly true in Tunisia, where the Luftwaffe held tactical air superiority for much of the campaign. Kesselring's inner confidence and professionalism, combined with a razor-sharp mind, made him a truly formidable opponent. In Italy, commanding both ground and air forces, he would conduct a faultless campaign, gradually withdrawing northwards and exacting a huge price for every Allied gain. By the early summer of 1943, there were more than 500,000 Allied servicemen in the Mediterranean theatre. This huge force included divisions from 7 nations. Most of these were British or American and had taken part in the battle for Tunisia. But the force also included divisions from French North Africa, New Zealand and India. And 2 fresh Canadian divisions were in the process of assembling and training for the Italian campaign. A Polish corps of 2 divisions was also being formed. Most of its recruits had suffered imprisonment in the Soviet Union following the defeat and division of Poland in 1939. But after Germany's attack on Russia in June 1941, the survivors had been released from captivity and assembled in southern Russia under the command of the veteran Polish general Władysław Anders. From there, they had made their way south across the Russian frontier, first to Persia and then to Iraq. There they were supplied and trained by the British in preparation for the Italian campaign. Training programs for all the Allied forces were generally much more thorough and focused than they had been in the past. In particular, amphibious operations were rehearsed extensively. Many of the setbacks suffered by the Allies in French North Africa had been due to inadequate preparation and poor training. Boat handling and assault landings in Morocco and Algeria had been dangerously flawed. More than 50% of the assault boats had been lost on the first day, and only the quick capitulation of the French defenders had prevented a catastrophe. By comparison, the naval forces had performed superbly, and naval gunfire in support of ground forces had been much more effective in North Africa than Allied planners had expected. For the invasion of Sicily, by far the most hazardous enterprise yet undertaken by the Allies, adequate naval support would be essential, and a force of more than 250 warships would be employed to cover and support the landings. The American M4 battle tank entered production in 1942 and utilized many of the proven features of its predecessor, the M3, such as the chassis, hull, engine and transmission system. But the 75mm gun was mounted in a fully traversable turret with a consequent height reduction of 15 inches. With greater armor protection, a reduced profile and a more effective gun mounting, the M4 was the first Allied tank to approach German standards and quickly became the main battle tank in service with both the British and American armies. The personal weapon of the British soldier for most of the 20th century was the Lee Enfield service rifle. The Mark V was an improved version of the model that had served the British Army throughout World War I and retained much the same basic design. The magazine held 10 rounds, which were loaded in clips of 5, and the adjustable sights gave it a remarkably high degree of accuracy. The weapon was also easy and cheap to mass produce, and was sturdy and reliable in service. The classic and probably the best submachine gun at the outbreak of war was the Thompson M1928. A simplified version, however, the M1, was quickly designed for wartime production. The M1 retained the principal advantages of its predecessor, while dispensing with some of its more expensive refinements. Although still a comparatively costly weapon, the M1 was produced in huge numbers to service an almost insatiable demand by America's allies for an effective and reliable light automatic weapon. Many were sent overseas as part of Lend-Lease and equipped British and French as well as American forces. The best light machine gun of World War II was based on a Czech design of the early 1930s and entered service with the British Army in 1938 as the Bren gun. Although its rate of fire was comparatively low, the gun was light and easy to handle. In adversity, it could be fired from the shoulder or hip. The versatility of the weapon, combined with its accuracy and reliability, made it ideal for infantry fire support at platoon and section level, and equipped most British Commonwealth and Dominion forces throughout the war. One of the most celebrated infantry support weapons of World War II was the American bazooka. Officially known as the M1 rocket launcher, the weapon was operated by a two-man team and fired a fin-stabilized projectile with a shaped charge warhead. The bazooka was designed as an anti-tank weapon, but could be used with equally devastating results against pillboxes and fortified positions. Nearly 500,000 bazookas were produced during the war, and the weapon provided the inspiration for the German Panzerschreck. Victory in North Africa had given a valuable boost to Allied morale. For the British, the Battle of Alamein had marked a turning point, and the advance west through Egypt and Libya had restored the British soldiers' sense of confidence and pride. For the Americans, the campaign, and particularly the battles of 1943, had turned raw recruits into seasoned veterans. They had been tested in the most adverse conditions against some of the best and most experienced formations in the German army, and after early reverses had recovered well and fought with skill and courage. The Allied forces in North Africa were also well supplied and superbly equipped. Their tanks, although slightly inferior to the best German machines, were vastly more numerous, and their infantry weapons were amongst the best in the world. Material superiority in all arms, thorough training programs, and extensive logistical support gave the Allied soldiers of all the various nations a level of morale second to none, enabling the fighting men to approach the coming battle with complete confidence in ultimate victory. While the battle for North Africa was still unresolved, the principal German presence in Italy consisted of Luftwaffe units committed to holding open the sea lanes between Italy and the few North African ports still in Axis hands. These included air defense formations as well as fighter and bomber groups, and most were concentrated in Sicily or southern Italy. In the summer of 1943, however, when the North African campaign came to an end, Hitler began reinforcing southern Europe with a few carefully selected German formations, and earmarked others for immediate transfer in the event of an invasion. These forces included Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions and parachute units. The Panzer divisions were amongst the best available and were equipped with a mixture of medium and heavy battle tanks. The Panzer Grenadier divisions, though well equipped, sacrificed armour for mobility, fielding a range of light and medium artillery, some of it self-propelled. Both types of division, however, were highly mechanized, and their attached infantry was normally fully motorized. The parachute units, on the other hand, were equipped only with light weapons, but their training was of the highest quality, and their combat experience was particularly suited to an Italian campaign. Like all airborne forces, German parachute troops were selected for their fitness and aggression. Their training program was more intense than most other soldiers, and more was expected of them. Parachute troops were trained to be self-sufficient, to fight both as an individual and as part of a team. As lightly armed assault troops, they would need to show a high degree of initiative, combined with speed and aggression. As a rapid reaction force in defense, these qualities would make them formidable opponents, particularly in the difficult conditions and mountainous terrain of mainland Italy. They had seen service in virtually all theatres, including Norway and the Low Countries, where they had demonstrated the new art of airborne warfare to an astonished world. In Crete, they had defeated a far superior British force by virtue of their aggression and skill, though suffering heavy casualties in the process. They had also served in North Africa and the Eastern Front, mainly in a defensive role. In July, the 1st Parachute Division was training in the south of France and was ready for immediate deployment, wherever the Allies should land. Self-propelled guns for infantry support were an integral part of German pre-war military planning, and the Stug series of assault guns utilized the chassis, suspension system and drivetrain of the Mark III battle tank. Dispensing with the turret reduced the weapon's profile significantly, and at the same time allowed armor thickness to be increased. From 1942, the series mounted a 75mm assault cannon, capable of engaging tanks as well as field targets, and protection was further increased with the addition of extra armor. Assault guns were originally intended for service in artillery regiments, but as the production of tanks was gradually overtaken by these weapons, increasingly, numbers were delivered to Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions. When the Mark III battle tank was discontinued in 1943, production was switched entirely to the assault gun, and more than 10,000 were eventually produced. The obsolete Czech-built 38T tank formed the basis for a number of highly successful self-propelled anti-tank guns. These were designed to utilize the tank's chassis and drivetrain, while massively outgunning it by replacing the turret with an open mantlet. This allowed the longer recoil of a larger weapon and gave the gunner increased visibility, although at the expense of protection. From 1942, they fulfilled an important role as auxiliary tank destroyers attached to mobile forces and were best employed in defense or in ambush. Self-loading rifles had been under development in Germany for many years, and these efforts finally bore fruit in the Walter Gewehr 41. The automatic bolt was operated by muzzle gases deflected back onto an annular piston. The Gewehr 41, however, although accurate, was muzzle heavy and unreliable, and was superseded in service by the Gewehr 43, an altogether better weapon, which also used the gas operating system. The Gewehr 43 was fitted with telescopic sights and was commonly used as a sniper rifle. The MG-34 was the first true general-purpose machine gun. It was light enough to be carried into battle and was belt-fed, allowing a prolonged and heavy rate of fire. The weapon was superbly crafted and had a dual-action trigger, giving the gunner the option of full or semi-automatic fire. The bipod could be positioned either at the end of the barrel for accuracy or near the breech for ease of maneuver. The weapon could also be mounted on a tripod frame, and the air-cooled barrel was easily and quickly changed, giving the gun the capability and performance of a heavy machine gun. Production of the MG-34 continued right up until the end of the war, and the gun also equipped all marks of German tanks. The standard German mortar throughout the war was an 80mm weapon, simply constructed and cheap to produce. The barrel, base plate and bipod could be carried as a three-man load, giving the infantry a light artillery capability at section level. The weapon had a well-deserved reputation for accuracy, and in the hands of an experienced mortar team could be employed to devastating effect in both an offensive and defensive role. Mortars caused more casualties amongst British and American troops than any other enemy weapon. What Hitler lacked in numbers, he had tried to remedy in terms of quality. Of the two German divisions in Sicily, the Hermann Göring division was deployed in the target sector and would be thrown into action on the first day. It was well equipped and carried the twin designations of a panzer and parachute formation. The division's personnel, although drawn mainly from the ranks of the Luftwaffe, were of the highest caliber and regarded themselves as elite troops. Morale within the ranks was high, as it was generally throughout the Wehrmacht's mechanized panzer and parachute divisions, and all of these shared an unwavering commitment to victory. While these deployments were taking place in southern Europe, the vast bulk of the Wehrmacht's offensive power was being concentrated in the east for the coming battle of the Kursk salient. A shortage of armor and equipment had caused the attack to be postponed 3 times, giving the Russians time to prepare their defenses and squandering the advantage of surprise. The build-up of force by both sides was enormous, and the Germans had committed most of their armor to the battle, including almost all of their heavy tanks. The battle opened early on July the 5th with a preemptive bombardment by the Russians. When the German attack began at dawn, they were already partially disorganized and made slow progress. Within 2 days, the northern attack by the German 9th Army had come to a virtual standstill after gaining only a few miles, while the 4th Panzer Army, attacking in the south, was becoming bogged down in increasingly desperate fighting. As the Allies completed their final preparations for the invasion of Sicily, the Germans were facing the prospect of yet another failure in the east. In early July 1943, while the Allies were completing their final preparations for an invasion of Italy, the Wehrmacht was fighting a critical battle of attrition with the Red Army on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk was intended to severely damage the Red Army, establish a strong defensive position for the Wehrmacht, and enable forces to be withdrawn from Russia to buttress the defenses of southern Europe. The battle had begun badly, with a preemptive Soviet artillery barrage, and had quickly become a slogging match in which the Wehrmacht could ill afford to become embroiled. Although German tactics and weapons were superior to those of the Red Army, the Red Army's seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower and material gave it greater endurance. Until the Battle of Kursk was resolved, there could be no major German redeployment from east to west. Meanwhile, from bases in North Africa, the Allies continued to prosecute the air war against Italy. Italian morale had already been gravely undermined by the loss of North Africa and the destruction of the Italian 8th Army on the Eastern Front. If the pressure was kept up by airstrikes and by landings in southern Italy, Allied commanders believed that Italian morale might collapse completely, leading to the defection of Italy from the Axis and a general capitulation. In the first week of July, the Allied invasion convoys began assembling in the ports and harbours along the North African coast. In addition to more than 250 warships, the invasion fleet would consist of a further 2,000 vessels. Mainly, these were merchant ships carrying supplies and equipment, landing ships carrying troops, tanks and vehicles, or assault craft of a variety of types. When the embarkation of men and equipment was complete, the convoys set sail for their final rendezvous areas north of Malta. In the assault wave were 8 divisions, nearly 200,000 men. Most of them were expected to be ashore by the 3rd day, along with more than 2,000 tanks and guns, 14,000 vehicles, and supplies of food, fuel and ammunition sufficient for several days' fighting. The invasion and conquest of Sicily was to be carried out by two Allied armies, both part of General Alexander's 15th Army Group. The American 7th Army was commanded by General George Patton, who had previously commanded the American 2nd Corps in Tunisia. For the assault landings on the south coast, 7th Army had 3 infantry divisions, with a further armoured division in reserve. The British 8th Army was commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, who had proved himself in North Africa one of the most able field commanders of the war. Landing in the southeast corner of Sicily, Montgomery had 4 divisions, 2 of which, the 50th and the 51st, were veterans of the North African campaign. The invasion fleet was deployed in 2 task forces. The Western Task Force was commanded by Vice Admiral Kent Hewitt of the United States Navy and would be responsible for landing and supporting 7th Army's troops. The Eastern Task Force, assigned to the British landings, was commanded by Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, mastermind of the Dunkirk evacuation and the Royal Navy's foremost expert on amphibious operations. Air support would be coordinated by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder as Commander-in-Chief of the combined Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. The principal Axis formation in Sicily was the Italian 6th Army, commanded by General Alfredo Guzzoni. 6th Army had a field strength of more than 300,000 men, deployed in 9 divisions. Most of these, however, were garrison commands, poorly equipped, ill-trained, and of low fighting value. The main striking force on the island was the 14th Panzer Corps, consisting of the 15th Panzer Grenadiers and the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The 14th Panzer Corps was under the administrative command of Lieutenant General Fridolin von Senger, who was also the German liaison officer with General Guzzoni's 6th Army. During the battle for Sicily, the 14th Panzer Corps would be reinforced by elements of a further 2 German divisions and placed under the temporary command of General Hans Huber, a veteran of the Eastern Front. Air support for the Axis forces in Sicily would be provided mainly by the German 2nd Air Fleet, which was now under the command of Field Marshal von Richthofen. 2nd Air Fleet had extensive bases in Sicily and southern Italy, and still possessed several hundred serviceable aircraft. On July the 9th, the wind rose unexpectedly, and the normally placid waters of the central Mediterranean grew high and rough. Within a few hours, winds of 40 miles an hour were sweeping in from the west, and the invasion armada was pitching and tossing in a growing swell. Although the British landings on the east coast would be sheltered from the worst effects of the weather, the American landings, if conditions persisted, would have a dangerous combination of crosswinds and high waves. Allied leaders considered the option of postponement, but the huge operation was already too far advanced, and the element of surprise would almost certainly be lost. Fortunately, there were indications that the wind might ease off during the night, and the decision was taken to proceed according to schedule. When the Allied invasion fleet approached the Sicilian coast in the early hours of July the 10th, the high winds which had bedeviled its passage from Malta had diminished to no more than a strong breeze. Hoping for surprise, the naval guns remained silent as the assault boats crept shoreward. Then, while still dark, they erupted in fury, pulverizing the coast in response to distant enemy artillery and machine gun fire. Over the next few hours, while the warships trained their guns on targets inland, the invaders swarmed ashore in ever-increasing numbers. The enemy coastal defenses proved completely inadequate and were easily overwhelmed. Their Italian garrisons were either routed or surrounded and forced to surrender. On the first day, the most determined resistance came from the Luftwaffe, flying mainly from bases in southern Italy. In the British sector, the landing areas came under intermittent attack, and a hospital ship was sunk. In the American sector, several vessels were hit, including the destroyer Maddox, which went down with heavy loss of life. These attacks persisted throughout the first 2 days of the landings, before Allied air superiority over the beaches could be properly established. The warships were also active during this period, in counter-battery fire and in breaking up enemy concentrations. 2 attempts by the Hermann Goering Division to drive wedges through to the coast were successfully defeated by accurate naval gunfire, and by the 13th, the division had gone over to the defensive. For the Allies, the initial stages of the campaign were marked everywhere by astonishing successes. All the landing beaches had been quickly secured at the cost of only a few hundred casualties, and during the first 2 days, they had put ashore 80,000 men, 10,000 vehicles, and 1,000 guns. By the 15th, the Allies had secured a firm lodgment in southern Sicily. In the British sector, Siracusa had been captured with its port facilities intact on the first day, and Augusta had been taken on the 13th. From Licata, Gela, and Scoglitti, the Americans had advanced between 15 and 50 miles inland, clashing first with the Hermann Goering Division and then with the 15th Panzer Grenadiers. Several Axis airfields had been captured and would soon be pressed into service as bases for Allied close support squadrons. West of Catania, the Germans had established strong defensive positions on either side of Mount Etna. These were held by an improvised battle group, supported by elements of the 1st Parachute Division, which had begun arriving on the 13th. On the 16th, Kesselring appointed Huber as commander of the 14th Panzer Corps, comprising all German formations in Sicily, and Luftwaffe flak batteries guarding the Strait of Messina. On the same day, he ordered Huber to begin a withdrawal to eastern Sicily and establish a defensive line anchored on the Etna Massif and running from Catania through Troina to San Fratello. On the 18th, these forces were further strengthened by the arrival of the 29th Panzer Grenadiers from Italy. West of Troina, the Axis front line was now held only by weak infantry formations of the Italian 6th Army. And on July the 19th, the Americans launched a major offensive towards the north coast and the town of Palermo. Within 4 days, all resistance had collapsed, and the whole of western Sicily had fallen into Allied hands. The fall of Palermo was a savage blow to Italian pride, and the first casualty was Mussolini, who was dismissed from office amid public protests and expressions of disgust. In Sicily, however, the Allies were making only slow progress. The Etna Massif and the rugged country around Troina provided the Germans with ideal defensive terrain, effectively cancelling out the Allies' huge numerical and material superiority. The battle for the Etna line was to be only the first in a series of battles fought in Sicily and Italy, in which the Allies would find their progress severely hindered by a combination of difficult terrain and brilliant German defensive tactics. The Etna line held throughout the first week of August, and when it was eventually breached, the advancing Allies found that the German defenders had merely withdrawn to new positions further east. When they abandoned the Etna line, the Germans withdrew only a few miles, anchoring their new positions on the town of Cesaro. Simultaneously, they began withdrawing their heavy equipment across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. On August the 10th, the headquarters of the Italian 6th Army was relocated to Reggio, leaving the defense of northeast Sicily to Huber's 14th Panzer Corps. Over the course of the following week, the Germans withdrew steadily and systematically, successfully evacuating more than 40,000 of their own troops, along with 60,000 Italians from Sicily to Italy. The conquest of Sicily netted the Allies nearly 150,000 Italian prisoners, but very few Germans. The campaign in many respects had been a resounding success, in others a disappointment. Italian resistance had proved far weaker than anyone had anticipated, and the Italian navy had not even left port, despite repeated German requests for assistance. Indeed, the contribution of the Italian armed forces to the defense of Sicily had been virtually negligible, encouraging the impression that Italy herself might be a hollow shell. But the Allies had suffered heavily at the hands of experienced German formations, who had retained the initiative to the end, conducting a phased retreat and escaping almost unscathed. In the last phase of the Sicilian campaign, the Allies had agreed to follow up the capture of the island with landings on the Italian mainland. The first of these was to be mounted by elements of General Montgomery's 8th Army across the narrow Strait of Messina. The landings on September the 3rd were uncontested. The Germans had prudently withdrawn the previous night, and the Italian coastal garrisons surrendered without firing a shot. As the British 8th Army advanced northwards along the toe of Italy, the American 5th Army, newly activated under General Mark Clark, was sailing for the Gulf of Salerno, 200 miles further up the coast. During the voyage, the invasion fleet was attacked intermittently by German bombers, and its progress was clearly being monitored by the Luftwaffe. But Allied commanders were confident of a successful operation. The landings on September the 9th were timed to coincide with a formal Italian surrender, and many of those aboard ship were expecting to walk ashore unchallenged. Their confidence was soon to be rudely shaken. When the first assault craft hit the beaches, the invaders suddenly found themselves under heavy fire. In the preceding weeks, Field Marshal Kesselring had deployed elements of 8 German divisions in southern Italy and had moved quickly, seizing control of the country and disarming the Italian army. For the Allies, the Battle of Salerno would be no walkover. On the first day, the landings were counterattacked savagely, and the fleet was harried by wave after wave of German fighters and bombers. While the assault troops swarmed ashore to seek safety and shelter behind the dunes, Kesselring was ordering reinforcements to the area for a full-scale assault on the beachhead. On September the 8th, 1943, the German 10th Army in southern Italy consisted of 8 divisions. 2 of these, the 26th Panzer and 29th Panzer Grenadiers, were withdrawing slowly northwards before the advance of the British 8th Army, and the 1st Parachute Division was deployed near Bari on the Adriatic coast to secure the line of retreat. The 2nd Parachute Division and the 3rd Panzer Grenadiers were in Rome, ready to seize power in the event of an Italian defection. The Hermann Goering Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadiers were refitting near Naples, leaving only the 16th Panzer Division at Salerno to face the American 5th Army's attack. For the assault phase of the landings, 5th Army had 3 divisions, with a 4th in floating reserve. Their primary objective was to secure a firm lodgment and then drive north towards Naples, which they expected to enter on the 3rd day. 16th Panzer, however, was deployed on high ground, dominating the beachhead area and the main roads leading north. On the first day, the Allies achieved only a shallow beachhead, far short of their objectives. 16th Panzer, meanwhile, deployed its artillery in the hills overlooking the beachhead and sent units to fortify the mountain passes north of Salerno. During the first 3 days, the division's main striking force was employed in counter-attacking British penetrations towards Montecorvino airfield and the important road junction at Battipaglia. On the 12th, the German defences were strengthened by the arrival of the 29th Panzer Grenadiers, and elements of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division took over the defence of the northern passes. On the same day, the Germans recaptured Battipaglia, which had now changed hands 4 times in as many days. On the 13th, they launched an attack down the corridor of the Selle River, driving to within a mile of the shore. The main weight of the attack fell on the Americans, who were thrown into confusion and very nearly routed. Indeed, so serious was the situation in the American sector that plans were secretly drawn up for an emergency evacuation. This was only averted by accelerating the build-up of reinforcements in the beachhead and by calling for support fire from the warships. During these engagements, the fleet remained under almost incessant attack from the air. 2 cruisers and a battleship were crippled and forced to withdraw, and numerous smaller vessels were sunk, including a destroyer and several transports. On the following day, the Germans attacked again, but the line held, thanks to coordinated action by Allied ground and naval forces and strong support from the air. Over a 24-hour period, Allied tactical and strategic aircraft flew nearly 2,000 sorties over the battle zone, dropping some 1,400 tons of bombs. By the 15th, the crisis had largely passed. Allied reinforcements continued to pour ashore, and the beachhead was steadily strengthened and pushed out. On the 16th, German resistance in the American sector slackened significantly, and advance units of Clark's Fifth Army met up with forward reconnaissance patrols from Montgomery's 8th, which had been pushing steadily northwards against determined German rearguards. North and west of Salerno, the British component of Fifth Army still faced strong resistance and occasional counterattacks, but it soon became obvious that these were mainly rearguard actions, and that the Germans were in the process of a phased withdrawal to the north. The arrival of 8th Army brought the Battle of Salerno to an end and created a broad front across the Apennine spine of Italy. But the Allies had achieved far less than they had hoped. The landings had failed to exploit the opportunity provided by Italy's capitulation, and those in the Gulf of Salerno had almost met with disaster. In addition to the damage wrought on the invasion fleet, the Allies had suffered twice as many casualties as their outnumbered opponents. Indeed, Salerno had been a much tougher test for the Allies than the invasion of Sicily, and signaled German determination to hold on to Italy for as long as possible. From Salerno, the Allies made only slow progress, entering Naples on October the 1st, more than 2 weeks behind schedule. They found the city in ruins and the port unusable. What had not been damaged by Allied bombing had been systematically demolished by the Germans prior to their evacuation. Restoring order and repairing the port would take many more weeks, consuming valuable resources and further delaying the advance north. Between Naples and Rome, the Germans had reconnoitred several lines of defense. Clark's Fifth Army reached the first of those on the Volturno River on October the 8th. The line was held by 3 German divisions, but was only partially prepared and was not intended as a main line of defense. On the 16th, after a week of hard fighting, the Germans began falling back to another, hastily improvised and temporary line 15 miles to the rear. On the Adriatic coast, the British 8th Army was also meeting stiff resistance. In early October, assault units crossed the Biferno River, but the intensity of the fighting brought the advance to a halt along the line of the River Trigno. During November, the Germans continued to pull back in stages, trading ground for time and inflicting heavy casualties on the pursuing Allies. The various dislocations and delays to the Allied timetable were now being felt by the troops on the ground. The Italian winter was setting in, and heavy rain was swelling the numerous streams and rivers, most of which ran directly across the Allied line of advance. Minor roads were often either flooded or churned to mud by the passage of so many tanks and heavy vehicles. Congestion of the few remaining major routes badly affected the movement of supplies and reinforcements. Closer to the front, the roads and main approaches were sown with mines and were often covered by enemy artillery. For the infantry, the weather brought misery, and the frustration of fighting in difficult and mountainous terrain against a skillfully retreating enemy drained morale. Compared to casualties from wounds, Allied soldiers actually suffered more heavily from sickness, including trench foot, an affliction not seen since the First World War. Italy was a campaign in which infantry and artillery played an inordinately important role. The terrain and conditions were simply unsuitable for tanks, and they were used only occasionally, mainly in a support role. Offensives were carried by mass gunfire and by infantry, attacking over rough ground or through rubble-filled streets. During November and early December, the Allied infantry fought a series of such actions, evicting the Germans, sometimes at bayonet point, from their mountain redoubts and strongholds. On the Adriatic coast, 8th Army pushed across the River Trigno, and then the Sangro. West of the Apennines, 5th Army was inching its way into the mountains overlooking the plain of Naples. But in December, both forces were beginning to come up against the forward defences of the Gustav Line, the last and by far the most formidable of the German defensive lines south of Rome. The Gustav Line ran from Ortona on the Adriatic coast along high ground dominating the valley of the River Sangro, and then through the Apennine Mountains to Minturno, at the mouth of the Garigliano. The line was heavily fortified and hinged on the forbidding fortress abbey of Monte Cassino. The abbey commanded the entrance to the Liri Valley, the only major route through the mountains to Rome. The northern end of the Gustav Line was held by the 76th Panzer Corps, which consisted of 4 divisions. The southern end, including Monte Cassino, was held by the 14th Panzer Corps, which also consisted of 4 divisions. But it was in this sector that Kesselring expected the main Allied offensive to be launched. Here, he concentrated the bulk of his reserves, a further 4 divisions, to prevent any Allied breakthrough into the Liri Valley. Facing the 76th Corps, 8th Army had 5 divisions, but the line of advance was not promising, and 8th Army operations were to be scaled down in favor of the main effort, which would be mounted by Clark's 5th Army. For the assault on the Gustav Line, Clark deployed 2 British divisions, 3 American divisions, and 2 French divisions. He also secured the transfer of 2 divisions from 8th Army to his own. The 5th Division was slotted into the line on the left of the 56th, and the 2nd New Zealand was placed with the 45th Division in tactical reserve. Thus, massively reinforced, 5th Army would attack across the Garigliano River and its northern tributary, the Rapido, aiming to break into the Liri Valley and collapse the German defences south of Rome. The offensive was launched on January the 17th, but despite some small gains in the coastal sector by the British 5th and 56th Divisions, the main attack across the Rapido by the American 36th Division met much stiffer resistance. On the 21st, instead of reinforcing and exploiting the British bridgehead, Clark insisted priority be given to the American effort and ordered the 36th Division to renew its assault across the Rapido. While the Americans pressed their offensive against the Gustav Line, a force of 2 divisions, 1 British and 1 American, was embarking for the town of Anzio, 60 miles further up the coast, and only 30 miles from Rome. The landings at Anzio were intended to cut the lines of communication to the Gustav Line and prevent the Germans from conducting an orderly retreat. The troops went ashore on the 22nd, completely unopposed. German reserves had been called south to combat 5th Army's offensive, and there were virtually no German units for miles. Despite this, Clark instructed the commander of 6th Corps at Anzio to secure a strong beachhead before pushing inland, with the result that the element of surprise was lost and the opportunity to win a significant victory in Italy was squandered. While 6th Corps consolidated its position and built up its supplies in the Anzio beachhead, Kesselring was ordering reserves to the area. Among the first to arrive were units of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the 4th Parachute Division, elite troops sent to block the main exits from the beachhead and seize control of the road and rail links between Rome and the Gustav Line. Within a few days, these would be joined by a further 6 divisions, some of them brought from as far away as France and Yugoslavia. Clark, meanwhile, had achieved little with his main offensive against the Gustav Line. In the first 2 days of the battle, the American 36th Division had lost nearly 2,000 men in repeated attempts to force a crossing of the lower Rapido. When this formation was exhausted, Clark ordered the 34th Division to attack higher up the river, hoping to take the town of Cassino and its abbey by flank envelopment. The abbey dominated the battlefield, and although not actually occupied by the Germans, possession of the hill itself and of other surrounding hills gave them a huge defensive advantage. German observation of Allied movements on the plain below was uninterrupted, and concentrated fire could be brought to bear on every attack. Once again, the American attack ran into a hail of fire, but by sheer perseverance, they carved out a bridgehead on the far side of the Rapido and began pushing forward into the hills. The first battle of Cassino was to last until February the 10th. The Americans, supported on their right flank by the French, made several important gains. The bridgehead was consolidated, and several key hills were taken, although at the cost of a further 4,000 casualties. At Anzio, there was only sporadic fighting in the first week after the landings. Kesselring still lacked sufficient strength for a decisive counterstroke, and was wary of wasting what he had in small-scale, unprofitable engagements. While reserves were assembled for a full attack, he ordered the beachhead to be contained and the Allied build-up to be disrupted by long-range artillery and airstrikes against the invasion fleet. These were murderously effective. Despite considerable losses in aircraft, the Luftwaffe inflicted immense damage, sinking or seriously damaging several warships and numerous transports. By early February 1944, the Allies had achieved only a precarious lodgment, nowhere more than 10 miles deep, and centered on the main road leading from Anzio to Rome. The original 2 assault divisions of 6th Corps, however, were being rapidly reinforced by a further 3, one of them armored, and despite the depredations of the Luftwaffe, the invasion fleet still possessed more than 20 major warships. Kesselring, by this time, had 4 divisions deployed in a defensive cordon, and 4 more assembling for an attack. On February the 7th, these were launched against a vulnerable salient created by the Allied thrust northwards. After heavy fighting, the Allies were driven back, but pausing briefly to reorganize, the Germans attacked again, driving straight down the road towards Anzio. On the first day, the Germans made good progress, punching a breach in the Allied lines 2 miles wide and a mile deep. The second day saw more modest gains as the Allies recovered and responded with local counterattacks supported by concentrated artillery and naval gunfire. The Germans pressed their offensive for a third day, but every fresh thrust was met by a deluge of shellfire and by determined fighting from the infantry. The line held, and on the 4th day, the Allies counterattacked vigorously, recovering some of the ground they had lost. But both sides were now exhausted, and both, in different ways, had suffered defeat. Although Kesselring's offensive had failed in its primary objective of driving the Allies back into the sea, it had badly shaken them and forced them back to inferior positions. More ominously, the Germans were now deploying for defense and seemed more than capable of containing the Allied beachhead indefinitely. With the failure of the 6th Corps to make progress at Anzio, it was clear that the Gustav Line would have to be taken by frontal assault. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, although unoccupied, was regarded by many Allied commanders as the single most formidable position in the entire line. The plan for the second Battle of Cassino called for the destruction of the Abbey by a massive air bombardment and for the subsequent capture of the hill and of the town below it. The destruction of the abbey, however, proved to be a military blunder of the first magnitude. The operation had been hastily mounted, and no attempt had been made to coordinate the airstrike with the ground offensive. Predictably, the ruins were quickly occupied by the Germans, providing them with an almost unassailable position. When the attack on the abbey was finally launched, 2 days later, by the 4th Indian Division, it was repulsed with heavy casualties. The attack on the town was equally unsuccessful. After a difficult assault crossing of the lower Rapido, 2 companies of the 2nd New Zealand Division fought their way through the edge of the town to the railway station. But there, they were soon counterattacked by German Panzer Grenadiers. The fighting in the town lasted for only 1 day. The outnumbered New Zealanders lacked heavy weapons, and the failure of the Indian Division to take the abbey and the commanding heights rendered their position untenable, forcing them to withdraw. Although the Second Battle of Cassino had been a costly failure, plans and preparations were already being made for a third. Once again, this was preceded by a massive airstrike, this time obliterating what remained of the town. The bombardment lasted for 4 hours, yet remarkably, failed in its main aim of dislodging the defenders. Indeed, the rubble-strewn streets proved virtually impassable to tanks, and provided the German parachutists, who had taken over the defense of the town, with an even stronger redoubt. The Third Battle of Cassino was pressed for 8 days, from March the 15th to the 23rd, and was to end in yet another impasse. In one of the most savage engagements of World War II, the infantry of the 2nd New Zealand Division and units of the German 1st Parachute Division duelled at close quarters, contesting every mound and crater. Although many of their comrades had been killed and almost all their heavy weapons destroyed in the bombardment, the parachutists rallied brilliantly, fending off with mortars, machine guns and rifles every attempt by the New Zealanders to clear them out of the town. By the 5th day, they had effectively regained the initiative and had established a strong position west of the railway station. Mounting casualties, exhaustion, and growing frustration eventually brought the battle to a halt. But the fighting among the ruins was to continue sporadically for weeks, as both sides attempted to consolidate or expand their positions. The failure of the Third Battle of Cassino finally convinced General Alexander that only a full-scale offensive against the Gustav Line could hope to succeed, and that General Clark was not the man to command the main attack. Accordingly, he stripped Fifth Army of its British and Commonwealth divisions and extended 8th Army's sphere of operations to include the Cassino sector and the entrance to the Liri Valley. The attack would be launched on a broad front, spearheaded by 9 divisions of 8th Army, and supported on the left by 4 French and 2 American divisions. Clark still retained operational responsibility for the 6th Corps at Anzio, which was reinforced by a further American division. 6th Corps was ordered to break out to the north when the main offensive was underway and cut off the German line of retreat. This was essentially the task for which 6th Corps had originally been put ashore 4 months earlier. The offensive opened on May the 11th, with a sustained artillery barrage by more than 2,000 guns. While 4 British divisions attacked across the Rapido into the Liri Valley, a Polish corps of 2 divisions attacked the Monte Cassino stronghold. The Poles were recent additions to 8th Army's frontline strength, and as well as being fresh, they were utterly fanatical and driven by an intense patriotism and hatred for the Germans. The Poles launched 2 offensives. The first made steady progress initially, but petered out in the face of bitter German resistance and fierce counterattacks. The second, mounted some days later, gained a key ridge west of the Abbey, threatening it with encirclement. Polish casualties by this time were frighteningly high, but the Poles were undeterred, either by their own losses or the ferocious fire that was directed at them from the Abbey and adjacent heights. That night, the Germans began withdrawing, and on the following day, the Poles raised a regimental pennant above the ruins of the Abbey, bringing to an end the 4th and last Battle of Cassino. While the Polish corps was fighting at Cassino, the British in the Liri Valley and the Americans on the extreme left wing were making only slow progress. The British attack, although strongly supported by artillery, faced the same problems that had defeated the Americans in January, in particular, very heavy and accurate defensive fire. In the coastal sector, the American Second Corps, consisting of 2 fresh divisions, launched its attack out of the Garigliano bridgehead. But this sector of the front had been static for months, and the German defenses were well organized. In the first few days of the battle, the Americans suffered heavy casualties, achieving only minor penetrations. In the mountains to the north, however, the French were making remarkable gains. On May the 13th, they had broken through surprisingly weak German defenses and were soon rapidly pressing forward through terrain previously considered by the Germans to be virtually impassable. The French breakthrough and the capture of Monte Cassino by the Poles opened the way for the Americans and British respectively. The Americans resumed their advance cautiously, but encountered only light rearguards. The Germans facing them, isolated and in danger of being cut off by the French, had quietly disengaged and were now in full retreat to the northwest. In the Liri Valley, the defense was more resolute, but the Gustav Line was no longer tenable, and the Germans everywhere were conducting a fighting retreat. By May the 22nd, the Gustav Line had crumbled completely, and a further fallback position had been breached. On the following day, 6th Corps launched its long-awaited breakout from Anzio. The German line of containment had been thinned out to provide troops for the Gustav Line, and there were no tactical reserves. Moreover, the blow fell on the weakest sector of the front. In 2 days of remorseless fighting, the Americans opened a huge breach in the defenses, capturing Cisterna on the 25th, and linking up with units of the American Second Corps advancing along the coast. The bulk of the German 10th Army at this time was still well to the east, and a push north by 6th Corps, with support from 2nd Corps, would almost certainly have cut the main German line of retreat. But this was rejected by Clark, who ordered 6th Corps to turn west and head directly for Rome. The maneuver took almost a day to complete, and when 6th Corps resumed its offensive, it soon ran into difficulties. The approaches to Rome were strongly held by German panzer grenadiers and parachutists, and the front was heavily fortified. The attack stalled, and the offensive broke down. On 8th Army's front, the German 10th Army was now rapidly disengaging and retreating through the Liri Valley towards Rome. Against 6th Corps, the remnants of the German 14th Army held the line until the end of May, when it too began falling back. During the first 3 days of June, the Germans completed their withdrawal, extricating successfully the bulk of their forces in southern Italy and surrendering Rome and the Tiber bridges intact to the Allies. The first American units reached the Italian capital on June the 4th. Ironically, not from Anzio, but from the Liri Valley. Yet the capture of Rome, although a great prize, had been marred by the failure of the Allies to coordinate their efforts and inflict a crushing defeat on the German forces in southern Italy. Both Clark and Alexander were at fault. Clark for his willful disobedience of orders and for his determination to see Rome liberated by the Americans. Alexander for his lack of forcefulness and resolution, and for allowing the campaign to degenerate into a race in which the only real winners could be the Germans. In the event, Clark's moment of glory was to be short-lived. On June the 6th, the Allies landed in Normandy, shifting the focus of Allied efforts from Italy to France, and relegating the Italian campaign to one of only marginal significance. In Italy, the fighting was to continue for a further year. From Rome, the Germans fell back to the northern Apennines, where they conducted a bitter and protracted defense through the winter and spring of 1945, before finally surrendering only a few days before the end of the war.